Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Tonight we have a 9-year-old tunnel story from 2015 where the writer used /x/ as a proving ground, as many did before sharing their works with the rest of the internet.
I was 14 when I went into the tunnels for the first time 11 years ago. It was almost the end of summer vacation, a few weeks before school started. There were 5 of us, 6 if you counted Chaz, a junior at Pace Middleton. He was going into his senior year and we were incoming freshmen. One of us, I think it was Rob, had met Chaz at a baseball camp. He told him about the tunnels and asked if he wanted to see it. Rob told us about it, and that was how we all wound up down there one Saturday morning in August. I remember looking at him as he talked. I had heard the stories about what happened to his friend. I didn't say anything to him. I never know what to say about stuff like that. Always go with a group, was the first thing he told us as he lifted the storm grate. It isn't safe to go alone. He walked us through the graffiti-covered main corridor with its nearly 7-foot-high clearances. The water pooled in the middle, less than half an inch deep. Pentagrams and weird cryptic symbols I didn't recognize covered the walls. Real edgy teen stuff. In between the graffiti, the walls were honeycombed with the genesis of other, smaller tunnels that branched off the main. Flashlights pointed down those holes revealed smaller tunnels, with ceilings anywhere from 4 feet high to ones that required crawling on hands and knees. We trailed behind Chaz in barely concealed awe, while he walked backward like a tour guide, explaining the history. He said he first went into the tunnels almost a year ago. That was when his friend Steve took him and his friend Ray down there and told them how he had found the place. Steve said it all started because he was looking for a place to get stoned. Ilswell is a small town, and like most small towns, its attitude on public drug use by teenagers is hardly progressive. Spurred on by the draconian anti-marijuana policies of our great nation, Steve wandered off to the south end of town, down by the river and the glass factory, in hopes of finding an isolated area to get high. That was where he noticed an old storm grate that seemed to be askew. Pulling it aside, he lowered himself down a worn path and was astonished to come out into the massive environs of the tunnels. After a few moments of wandering around the cavernous space, he realized he was not only in a bizarre, empty space, but he was in a bizarre, empty space that was completely free of parents, police, or any of the other patrician forces who would care if he smoked in public, which he did. And then the next day. And then the next day after that. Pretty soon, the tunnels became a home away from home for him, which is when Steve started to wonder why a small town like Ilswell needed such a massive, intricately linked tunnel system. A series of pipes to take away excess rainwater made sense. What he had discovered made no sense. There were hundreds of tunnels, fanning in all directions. They followed no plan as far as he could tell. Some looped in circles, others terminated abruptly. Still others seemed to go off for miles, with no end in sight. It was baffling, and it seemed like it shouldn't have existed. And after Steve spent a few hours researching the city's history, he found out that he was right. It didn't exist. At least that's what the public record said. The tunnels were not real. On paper, the city of Ilswell had, as one would suspect, an extremely basic water drainage system. One large pipe ran north to south and 10 smaller crisscrossed the rest of the area. The infrastructure had been built in the early 50s, and as far as Steve could tell, hadn't been adjusted since. These facts stood in stark contrast to the reality of what was underneath the town. So much so that Steve wasn't even sure if he was going crazy. So he began to conduct himself scientifically. He swore Chaz and their other friend Ray to secrecy and then enlisted them in his project, explaining as much as he could while trying to sound as sane as possible. Once all the parties were all on the same page, the 3 descended the tunnels armed with pens, compasses, and notebooks. They were going to map the system and find out exactly what was going on. Almost immediately, bad luck struck. One of them, Ray, was grounded for failing geography, an irony lost on no one. And then there were 2 weeks of solid rains rendering the tunnels impassable. By the time the rains had ceased and everything was dry enough to explore, Nearly a month had passed. Once they got in the tunnels, the frustration vanished in the face of their task's immensity. Beneath Ilswell, the tunnels splayed out in 100 contradictory directions. The job to map them, the boys realized, was Sisyphean at best. Nevertheless, they tried, diligently going after school to wander and sketch starting points and ending points and everything in between, meeting up later as a group to map out the territories as best as they could. Which is when, almost 2 months into the project, they realized why the area was so large. New tunnels were appearing. They didn't know how it was possible. There was no construction work, no jackhammers and no machines, but somehow new tunnels were coming into existence at a rate of nearly one a week. Ones with ragged edges and the same sort of bizarre graffiti that infected the main corridor. Weird human-like shapes but hunched over and with tails, painted in a strange shining black ink. Steve and his friends decided they needed to talk to someone about what they had discovered. Ray's dad was the unanimous selection. Not only was he a lawyer, he was also friendly with some people in the local government. Out of anyone they could approach, they assumed he was the most likely to be able to help. Long story short, he wasn't. First, Ray's dad told the boys they must have made a mistake. When confronted with the unimpeachable facts of their maps, he grew silent, studying them. Then he cleared his throat and told the three that the tunnels weren't a place for kids, that he knew about them, that everyone in charge of Ilswell knew about them, and that the boys were putting themselves at risk going down there. The tunnels, he explained, weren't for us, but he declined to say who they were for. He made the three swear on the Bible that they wouldn't talk about it and would certainly never go down there again. After he left the room, the boys stared at each other in Ray's living room with its nice TV and huge bookshelves and expensive furniture. "What the fuck was that?" Steve whispered. Ray, Steve, and Chaz decided to ignore Ray's dad's advice. They were going to keep going into the tunnels until they discovered what was going on down there. They planned on starting that night, but the prediction of storms had them put their plans on hold. The next morning, as rain came down in great sloughs, drenching the landscape and turning the world gray and blurry, Chaz called Steve. Ray had disappeared last night. He must have gone into the tunnels before the storm started. After he hung up the phone, Steve rode his bike down to the storm grates, pedaling so fast he crashed twice. When he got there, all he could do was stare at the flooded corridor. They found Ray's body a few weeks later, bloated and egg-sack white from the unrelenting waters. He was naked too, but the police ascribed that to the simple process of drowning and the degradation of the elements. But there was something else. The body was covered in bite marks. Small, tiny bite marks. It was odd in that he hadn't even been partially consumed, just almost nibbled. The bites formed a strange, cryptic pattern that Chaz and Steve immediately recognized, staring at the visible wounds on the neck of their friend's corpse in his black coffin. When they left the funeral home, they looked at each other. "Those marks," Chaz said. "They're the same as the ones on the walls of the corridor," Steve finished. "And that," said Chaz, finishing his story as we stared at him, open-mouthed and gaping, "was when we decided we needed to find out what was going on in the tunnels." His words echoed in the suddenly sinister space of the great main corridor in which we stood, our shoes wet in the standing water. "Why'd you tell us this? Is this a joke or something?" I asked, my voice suddenly. "We need help. We can't do this on our own. I don't want Ray to die over this and then nothing happens. We want to figure this out. You guys want in?" I believed him. His story sounded so absurd. Part of me was worried it was a prank, and I was going to be the incoming freshman getting punked by the senior. But the way he was staring at us, his eyes hollowed out and glowing, made something in me that usually wasn't there. I spoke up, my voice ringing in the enormous place. "Sure," I said. "I'm in. What's the worst that could happen?" Unfortunately, I found out. Chaz was now almost 30, but he looked older than that with his thinning hair and gray stubble. His teeth were bad when he smiled, which he didn't do a lot of, which was sort of a good thing, I guess. I had agreed to meet him while I was home for a few days, but I told him I didn't want to talk about the tunnels or what had happened to Steve. He said that would be fine. I got the sense that he was lying. We met at a fast food Mexican place near my parents. It had opened after I moved out. I'd only been back to Ilswell twice since turning 18, once for Christmas, once for my dad's funeral. And other than new taco places, it hasn't changed at all. Chaz had, which he acknowledged. I look different, huh? We all do, I said, waving my hand. But we didn't all look different like he did. He looked battered. It's my job, they treat me like shit. Where do you work? I asked. I wasn't really that curious. I just was trying to make conversation. Meehan Hospital, up near Grayson. That's quite a commute. No jobs here, man. So it's either a drive or no drive. A drive is definitely better, yeah, I hear you. Plus, he said in between bites of his soft taco, I'm pretty sure that the hospital has something to do with the tunnels. I put down my taco and stood up. It was good seeing you, Chaz, I said. I'll talk to you later. No, don't get up, please. Sit down, please. Okay? I stared at him. He looked so desperate, rail-thin and rat-like in the dirty fast food light. I sighed and sat down. I'm not talking about them, Chaz. I don't want to think about them. I work in the animal labs at the hospital, he interrupted me. They do experiments on animals, the neurosurgeons. You know that? They experiment on all kinds of animals. Cats. I said I'd stay here, but not if you're... Monkeys, dogs. I'm not going to just sit and listen to... Rats, he said, and he made eye contact with me. He stopped talking, and so did I. I clean the cages in there, he began after the silence, and I hear things when nobody else is in there, and the things I hear. He looked away, at the register, at the sign for the bathrooms, then back at me. It sounds like that noise. I feel like sometimes I can still hear that noise, I said. I felt faint. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to be talking about this. Above us, the ceiling fans spun lazy circles. I never went back, he said. He leaned across the table. After that night in there, I never went back. I still go to Ray's grave once a year. I stopped going to Steve's. But I worry. I worry about... I don't want to talk about it, I shouted, and slammed the table. Some mom with her kids stared at me. I lowered my voice. I'm not here to talk about it. Some kids got the maps from me, he said nonchalantly. I think they're going to go in. What? I hissed. When? When did they get the maps? The mom with the kids was still staring at me. The other day ago. They're missing. They're the missing kids on the news. You gave them the maps. After what how can you do that, Chaz? They asked. He shrugged. Neighborhood kids. They heard the rumors. I figured we made it out. Maybe they can too. When did they go in? 2 days ago, he said. I think. I got up. Where are you going? He asked. He sounded surprised. With you to fix a mistake you shouldn't have made. But it's starting to rain, he said. I looked at the water hitting the windows. We have time. The last time I was in the tunnels, I was 17. Out of all my friends, I was the only one who went with Chaz and Steve. The other guys thought I was nuts. I was. I wanted to figure out the secret as much as the other two did. My whole life I had read books about mysterious cities and strange other worlds, and here was one under my own feet. I felt like I was on the verge of interrupting a grand mystery. I felt elated. I also felt boredom, for as mysterious as the tunnels were, they were also essentially just big fucking holes. The weird graffiti was baffling, as was the emergence of new tunnels, but none of that ever turned into anything. I thought that maybe it never would, until that night. We went in late, after 7. The streetlights were all on, and it had been raining on and off all day. We thought the tunnels would be still dry enough to get through without any flooding. We were right about that, at least. The years of obsessive exploring hadn't been good for any of us. I was in high school and everybody thought I was the weird kid who didn't do anything, didn't date anyone, and only hung with 2 shady older dudes. Steve was inarguably the most well-adjusted. He worked part-time at a packing facility, lived in his own little apartment, and had even started seeing some girl. In contrast, Chaz had fallen apart. Something about Ray's death had driven him crazy. He copied down the patterns on the walls and filled notebook after notebook with drawings of them. I think he thought it was an alphabet, like hieroglyphics. Or maybe he believed it was some sort of weird code. No matter what he actually thought it was, his increasing devotion to it and the subject of the tunnels in general was troubling to Steve and I. Chaz had also started taking acid before he went underground, something he hadn't told us. I'm not sure how neither of us hadn't figured it out, but somehow it slipped by both of us. Later, Chaz told me that the drug's effects, combined with his nearly psychopathic focus on the area, allowed for an intense quasi-religious experience. He explained that the dark and the hallucinations made him feel that he was on the verge of discovering Sun's kind of God. Going into the tunnels that night, something felt strange. My pulse was racing as I walked into the corridor. "Let's go," Steve said. "We can finish tunnels 19 to 24 tonight if everything breaks right." The tunnels we were working on that evening were small and cramped. We had to crawl through most of them, which I hated. The trapped claustrophobia of it, the tips of the concrete scraping my shoulders, my face almost in the dirty ground with insects and that underground smell. I had been hearing a noise the last few times we went down, a strange sort of chittering. I asked the other two and they said they hadn't heard it. This night, as I crawled into Tunnel 21, I heard it again, louder. The graffiti in 21 was bizarre. Lots of crude drawings of what almost looked like houses with strange hunched-over things in them. Things with long tails. 21 was also one of the narrowest. I could barely fit through some of the smaller sections. Then I came around a corner. The chittering was so loud, I gasped. The tunnel opened up to nearly 3 feet high. There, along the edges, were strange, horrifically primitive drawings of 4 humans. They were nearly cubist in their approximations of the human form, but there was also a horrible familiarity to them. They were pictures of Steve, Chaz, Ray, and me. The picture of Ray had X's through his eyes. The chittering was getting louder. I turned around and wedged myself into Tunnel 21. I was screaming for the other two as I scrambled through the dirty cement hole. I came out into the corridor. Ray was standing in shock in front of the tunnel he had been in. "We have to go," I was screaming at him. "Where is Steve?" He didn't say anything, just pointed behind me. I turned around. Steve was at the edge of the corridor. Something was holding a black hand, or maybe a paw over his mouth. His eyes looked like 2 moons glowing in the black night. I could tell he was trying to scream. The dark thing was with other dark things. They were hunched over, almost human, but obviously not. Even in the darkness, I saw long tails, I heard the chittering. It almost sounded like human speech. I heard a noise next to me and turned. It was Chaz running as fast as he could away from the things and toward the exit. I turned back and saw Steve vanishing into a tunnel. I wanted to say I tried to save him, but I can't lie. I ran, following Chaz, out of the tunnels forever. Until now. Chaz and I stood in front of the entrance. He was scratching his arm. I could see scab marks along his veins. I remembered him that night, him telling me how he was never going back. I remember how he got strung out after that, hearing how he got arrested for meth, for heroin, for breaking into a car. I thought about how I had gone to school out of state and stopped speaking to anyone, just working, writing, reading. I thought about how I had started drinking during the day, drinking all the time, just not to think about this. I looked at Chaz. "Let's go," he said. "This isn't going to get any easier." The tunnels were bigger than they used to be. Things usually reduce as you get older. Here, my past seemed to expand to swallow me whole. As we walked in, I heard the chittering. It sounded like a chorus. "I shouldn't have given them the maps," Chaz said. He sounded like he had said that 1,000,000 times to himself and he was practicing it aloud. "They gave me money." "It's okay," I said, even if it wasn't. "Maybe we can find them." The rainwaters were beginning to trickle into the corridor. Our flashlights glared at dull yellow beams on the walls. I didn't think we were going to find them. That noise. "It's the same one in your lab." "I think," he said. "It sounds so much like that. And the rats look weird. They don't look right. They look smart, like they know something." I thought I heard something moving behind me. I spun around and swung the flashlight. If there was something, I didn't see it. But there it was, in front of Tunnel 43. An old tennis shoe. "Do you think that shoe is one of the kids?" I asked Chaz. He shrugged. "Maybe." We decided to try the tunnel. It was a low one, but not so low you had to crawl. I could hear the water starting to splash in the main corridor. We walked hunched over, me behind Chaz. The tunnel was a long one, filled with the graffiti. I hadn't been there in so long that the vivid strangeness of the art grabbed me, but the obvious rage in the work shocked me. It showed people killing, shooting, dying in a world where the sun shone and birds flew and flowers grew, while underneath, the things with tails showed their teeth and wept. The chittering was getting louder. The weird noise was turning familiar. Something in its pattern. I couldn't catch it. We turned in the tunnel and Chaz, who was slightly ahead of me, gasped and stopped. I came out from behind him and froze. In front of us, in a small room, pressed against each other, on top of each other, and suddenly staring at us, were hundreds of rats. But they weren't quite rats. They were too big, at almost 2 or 3 feet tall, and their faces carried too much weird humanity in them to be only rats. But their tails, their greasy fur, their long quivering noses, that was a rat. That was all and only rat. I couldn't scream. All I heard was their chittering. I could smell them, a hot, wet smell like garbage in the sun. I felt sick. I thought of Steve, those things biting into him, all of them, chewing and chewing and chewing, and "It's one of the kids," Chaz pointed. He sounded emotionless, like he was pointing out a car on the highway. "They have him on that stone." I looked. There was a stone in the front of the space, and tied to it was a dead teenager. His chest had been cut open. A rat stood next to him with bloody paws holding something raw and red. "They cut out his heart," Chaz said. "This place. It's a church. Look." He was right. The rats were all facing the stone, which was obviously an altar. The lead rat had some kind of cloth wrapped around its shoulders. Behind him was another drawing, just of one face this time. Someone I immediately knew. But the way the rat stood, the way the air felt, we had interrupted some sort of religious ceremony. This was prayer. Chaz looked at me. "Good luck," he whispered, and then started screaming and ran into the rats. I saw him bitten almost immediately as he was swallowed in a sea of brown fur, and then I was back in the tunnel, running as quickly as I could. The last thing I remember is my feet slipping on the slick ground and hitting my head on the edge of a rock. The last thing I thought was that this was how I was going to die. I woke up in the hospital. The cops said they found me half drowned, but somehow still alive at the edge of the entrance to the storm sewers. Next to me was one of the missing kids. He hadn't been so lucky. I told the cops I heard the kids had gone into the tunnels and I had gone in trying to rescue them. I don't know if they believed it or not. Maybe they didn't care. I got out of the hospital the other day. Nobody answers Chaz's phone. I don't think anybody will. I don't know why they let me out of the tunnels and not him, or Steve, or anybody else. I never told Chaz how my dad used to work at Mean Hospital. I never told him my dad never said what it was he did. All I know is he was funded by the government to learn how to make better people for a better world. It's secret stuff, he told me when I would ask, trying to make the world a better place no matter what. I'm worried his better world is under our feet. I'm worried it's growing too fast. I'm worried that I can't ask him about it because he's been dead for years. And I'm worried because I just heard his voice, sounding as strange and as inhuman as his portrait had behind the altar of the rats, asking me to leave my room and see him downstairs, to come and see his wonderful better world.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check the Odyssey and Rumble pages for separate archives of previous broadcasts.